Little Plum by Rumor Godden, Chapter 5. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday went by before Belinda could climb the ilex tree again. Days and days, sighed Belinda. She was too sore and stiff to do more than hobble, and though her lip was better, her eye was so purple and swollen that Mother kept her back from school. She seemed, too, a little suspicious of what Belinda had been doing when she hurt herself, and would not let her out of her sight. Mother had never once asked what had happened to Belinda when she hurt herself so badly, though all the others said, "What were you doing?" "I fell over the wheelbarrow," said Belinda, which was true. She, the chair, the box, and the flower pot had fallen over the side. "Over the wheelbarrow? How could you?" "I did," said Belinda. "But how did you hurt yourself like that?" said Anne, and Tom shrugged and said, "Try your room." Nona was wiser. "I knew what you were doing," she said, trying to reach the ilex branch. Mother asked no questions, but when Belinda was better, Mother looked at her closely and said, "Belinda, if I were you, I should try to put the Tiffany Joneses right out of your head." "Yes, Mother," said Belinda, but how could she do that when the Tiffany Joneses were next door? Then came another half-holiday, a Thursday, when Nona had had her friend Melly Ashton to tea. Mrs. Ashton brought Melly and was to have tea in the drawing-room with Mother while the children had theirs in the playroom. Melly and Nona were there now, making a set of clothes for Peach Boy. Belinda knew what they were doing, but as it was supposed to be a surprise, she had to keep out of the way. Anne and Tom were out. There was nothing for Belinda to do, and "I believe," said Belinda, "even if I am still stiff and can only see out of one eye, I believe I will go up the ilex tree." As she let herself quietly out the garden door, she could hear Mother's and Mrs. Ashton's voices in the drawing-room, Nona and Milly laughing in the playroom. Belinda quietly shut the door, went round to the tree, and though it hurt her leg, pulled the box out of the bushes. She got up on it, holding to the rope, stretched her foot up to the lowest rung of Tom's ladder. It could just reach, and though she said "ouch" when her weight came on her wrenched shoulder, she pulled herself up by her hands and then went up rung by rung until she reached the first big branch. After that it was easy. She could climb from one branch to another until she came to the platform the boys had built for the floor of their house. It was not large. There was just room enough for a chair, 2 stools made of logs sawn off so that they stood levelly, and a rusty spirit stove. Then, did they cook up here? Belinda wondered in admiration. It seemed they had. A packing case cupboard was nailed to the tree, and in it was what looked like a packet of dried-up sausages, a few old potatoes, and a loaf green with mold. Belinda threw them down the tree. There was also a spoon, a bottle opener, a plastic cup, and a notebook in a cupboard. Belinda tried to read the notebook, but it was so soaked that the pages had stuck together and the ink had run. From the platform, a ladder led up to the branches above, on which she could see 3 doormats tied. Were those their bedrooms, she wondered? The ladder, she could see now, was only a bit of a ladder, perhaps a cherry ladder that had broken off short, or Tom had sawn it, but it was high enough to reach the bedroom branches, about 6 feet long. Now that she had seen it at last, Belinda did not think the house so very exciting. Of course, it had been deserted long ago, but even then, thought Belinda, what did excite her was that from where the platform had been built against the ilex trunk, a pair of branches went across the hedge so far that they almost touched the fire escape next to Jem's sitting room window. The lower branch was big, ending in a fork with a spread of dark green leaves. The upper branch was thin and leafy so that it made what Belinda called a roof over the lower one. I could sit on the big one and wriggle to the fork, thought Belinda, and nobody would see me. Belinda never waited. In a second, she had lowered herself from the platform to sit astride the branch, and then she began to work herself forward. It was perilous. The hedge with the garden path on the fell side, and one of the Tiffany Joneses' new paved paths on the side of the house next door was below her. The paths at least 14 feet below, but it never occurred to Belinda to look down, and quite happily she worked her way out along the branch, her hands holding onto it, her legs dangling. She was holding her breath, too, with excitement, and her cheeks were crimson. Every now and then the big branch had smaller side ones, so that she had to slide her leg over them. Now, though almost hidden by the ilex leaves, she was really close to Jem's sitting room window with the rose creeper round it. She could see right into the beautiful room with its desk and small white piano, the pale walls and flowered rug. She could see the big dollhouse, dolls' beds, and dolls' furniture. There were pictures, and the bookcases were filled with dozens of books, thought Belinda. If she turned her head and bent sideways, She could see into the bedroom, too, with its pale blue four-poster bed, the dressing table that matched it, and on which were small-sized silver brushes and combs and clothes brushes. A little armchair covered in rosy chintz had a dress laid on it, ready for Jem to change into, a velvet dress with a ruffle round the neck. A book was thrown down by the bed. We're not allowed to throw books down like that, thought Belinda virtuously. But on the other hand, Jem's shoes were not left all anyhow, as Belinda's often were, but set neatly side by side. But Madsen did that, I expect, thought Belinda. Both rooms were more beautiful than any Belinda had seen, but suddenly she was not looking at the rooms. She had seen something else. She looked, blinked, looked again, and then quickly, far more quickly than she had come forward, she wriggled backwards along the branch to the platform, where she turned herself round and, forgetting all about soreness and stiffness, almost tumbled down the branches. When she reached the ladder, she swung herself down it, dropped and landed on the grass, not stopping to hide the box, ran limping and hopping into the house, where she burst into the playroom. "What do you think?" panted Belinda, only she was so out of breath the words all ran together. "What do you think?" Nona and Melly looked up in astonishment. Melly had hastily hidden their work under her dress. They looked astonished as, "What do you think?" panted Belinda. They did not know what to think, because they could not understand her. They had to wait until Belinda recovered her breath. "Nona, Melly, what do you think?" Now words were a little clearer. "What do you think? Jem, she has a Japanese doll." Miss Happiness and Miss Flower were kneeling close beside Nona on their red and blue cushions, while Peach Boy had a cotton reel as a stool. They, too, heard Belinda's announcement, and "Then the honorable gentleman didn't only bring the lantern," said Miss Happiness, and Miss Flower said, "Another new person has come to live at the house next door." Together they softly whispered, "Aisatsu suru," which is the Japanese for welcome. 3 people were on the big branch of the ilex tree, Nona behind Belinda, Melly behind Nona. They had both been frightened to leave the platform and go out along the branch. In fact, Melly had had to shut her eyes and wriggle blindly forward, holding on to Nona, but Belinda encouraged them in whispers, and now they were all far out on it, looking over one another's shoulders into Jem's sitting room. "And there, I told you, look," whispered Belinda. "Look on Jem's windowsill." Nona and Melly looked in, and "She is a Japanese doll," said Nona, marveling. The doll was little, perhaps 3 inches high, "almost as small as little Peach," whispered Belinda, but she was unmistakably Japanese. She seemed to be made of the same plaster as the others, and perhaps had the same rag body with a plaster face and little plaster hands and feet. Her feet were bare, and, as if she were not much more than a baby, her legs were curved to sit down. "Like Peach Boy's," said Belinda. Her eyes were black glass, and she, too, had little painted eyebrows. Her mouth was painted in red and looked like a half-open rosebud. Her hair was black with a fringe, but she had a top knot wreathed with white blossoms and pinned with a tiny silver pin. She was dressed in a pale blue kimono, the color of a pale blue winter sky, patterned with sprays of white flowers, and her sash was pink. "Look at her hair, her topknot with the blossom," whispered Melly. "Look at her kimono, that's plum blossom on it," whispered Nona. "She looks like a girl, little Peach Blossom," said Belinda. "Only she's not Peach, she's Plum. Little Plum, that's her name." In her excitement, Belinda raised her voice. "We will call her Little Plum." Nona hushed her, then objected. "You can't give a name to somebody else's doll." Belinda's eyes grew bright and determined. "She is Little Plum," said Belinda in a very loud whisper. "I wish I could go over and touch her," thought Belinda. "I wish the big branch stretched that far. I wish our dolls could play with Little Plum. I wish, oh, how I wish," thought Belinda, "that I could go next door." On the way back from school next afternoon, Nona and Belinda met Miss Tiffany Jones, and, to their surprise, she stopped them. Then she looked them over in her condescending way. They were certainly very different. In fact, you could not imagine 2 more different girls. Nona, in her dark blue coat and beret, was neat. Her striped school muffler was wound around her throat, the 2 ends crossed tidily on her back and held by her belt. Her long socks were straight, her shoes clean, and she had on her gloves. Belinda had been in a hurry when she put on her things to go home. Her beret was crooked, her coat buttoned wrongly, her muffler dangled anyhow, her socks were falling down, and her shoes were muddied where she had carefully stepped in all the puddles. "Well, I like puddles," said Belinda. As Miss Tiffany Jones's eyes came to Belinda, her eyebrows went up and her mouth turned down. Then she turned back to Nona. "You seem a nice, quiet child," she said. "Thank you," said Nona. She did not know what else to say. She could not really believe she was talking to Miss Tiffany Jones. "What is your name?" I am Nona. This is Belinda. Nona tried to bring Belinda in, but Miss Tiffany Jones ignored her. You are how old? 9, said Nona. Belinda is 8. Jem is 9, too, said Miss Tiffany Jones. My brother wants her to make friends with you, and yes, I should like her to have a little nicely mannered friend. I will write your mother a note. She isn't my mother, said Nona. She's my aunt. Your aunt, to ask if you may come to tea. And Belinda? Asked Nona. Miss Tiffany Jones's gaze came back to Belinda once more. It went over the crooked beret, the wrong buttons, the trailing muffler, wrinkled socks, and muddy boots. Belinda? She repeated. I'm afraid not, Belinda. She is impossibly rough. I'm afraid I couldn't allow Jem to play with her. Belinda's face went as scarlet as if she had been slapped. She had to bite her lip to keep it from shaking, and she scuffed the pavement with the toe of her shoe. Color came into Nona's face, too, a bright pink spot on each cheek. Her head went up, and she said, Thank you, but I don't go to tea without Belinda. She took Belinda's hand, and they walked away up the road. When they got into their own garden and the gate was shut, Belinda said through clenched teeth, I hate all Tiffany Joneses. Nona and Melly refused to go up to the ilex tree again. Indeed, the children had had great difficulty in getting Melly down it, but Belinda went up every day, because I'm sorry for little Plum, she said. Belinda, as you may have guessed, was not fond of dolls. She liked ponies, boats, roller skates, helping Tom with his carpentry. She was glad to let Nona, and Miss Happiness and Miss Flower, of course, look after Peach Boy. Then why should she suddenly have such an interest in a little doll, and one that did not even belong to her? Jem doesn't play with her, she told Nona. I expect she thinks it is an ornament, said Nona. A doll an ornament? Miss Happiness and Miss Flower were shocked. But I have seen Matson dust her, said Nona. Dolls wouldn't need to be dusted if they were played with, said Miss Happiness, and Miss Flower wished that her plaster neck would have let her shake her head in dismay. Nothing is worse for a doll than not to be played with. Perhaps Belinda caught their serious thoughts. Why doesn't Jem play with her? She asked. Perhaps she doesn't know how, said Nona. Said Belinda. She was silent a moment, and then she said, It would be fun to teach her. Nona, she asked a day or two later, could you make a little padded coat? A tanzan? Yes, like Miss Happiness's, and Miss Flower's, only smaller. Poor little Plum looks so cold. Miss Happiness and Miss Flower were charmed. They had not ceased to talk and wonder about the little doll over the way. Miss Belinda wants to make little Plum warm. Little Miss has a heart of gold, they said. But you're not teasing Jem again? Asked Nona. Belinda opened her eyes wide, so they looked very innocent. How could I tease her? She asked. How could I when I never see her, and she will never see me? Said Belinda, and chuckled. Please make a little tanzan, she begged. In a day or two, the coat was made. It was short, of scarlet silk, wadded with cotton wool and scarlet cords to tie it. Nona had learned the shape of a tanzan from the books Mr. Twilfit had lent her. Nona was getting very clever with her fingers. Really, I think you sew better than Anne, said Mother. To go with the coat was a pair of tabby, so small they fitted the tip of Nona's little finger. They too were soft and warm, and they should just fit, she said. Then she, who hardly ever asked questions, did ask one. Belinda, asked Nona, how will you get the socks and coat to little Plum? That was the question. You could post them, said Nona. Miss Tiffany Jones might open the parcel, or Matson, said Belinda, and she said thoughtfully, Matson doesn't go near the windowsill after she is dusted, but Jem does now 2 or 3 times a day. She stands there. I have seen her, though she doesn't look at us. She does, Miss Happiness and Miss Flower could have said. Indeed she does. Little Miss often looks across at us. But Belinda was too busy thinking to pay attention to the dolls. I must put the coat and socks on the windowsill, she said. But how? Asked Nona. Somehow, said Belinda. And Belinda went up the ilex tree to think. She thought of getting Tom's fishing rod and dropping a parcel on Jem's windowsill, but how would she get the parcel off the hook? She was a good thrower, but she could not be sure of throwing a parcel so that it would go in through the window or else lie on the window ledge. It might drop into the garden, and the gardener find it and take it into Miss Tiffany Jones. No, I must take it myself, decided Belinda. Even if she could have reached it, she could not climb up the rose. Its stems were too slender, and besides, it was prickly. She wondered if she could jump across onto the fire escape, but even holding to the upper branch, it would be difficult to jump off the fork, and how could she jump back? She could perhaps have swung on the upper branch across onto the fire escape and then run down it to slip through the garden, but I'm not allowed in the next door garden, thought Belinda. She thought and brooded, and each time her eyes and her thoughts came back to the fire escape. It was as elaborate as everything else belonging to the Tiffany Joneses, a twisting spiral of iron with railings and a small landing on each floor. Each one of these landings was just by Jem's window. From the fork to that landing was not very far, and suddenly, I believe I could make a bridge to it, thought Belinda, if I could slide, say, a plank or something across until one end was on the fire escape, the other on the fork. Then I could stand on the landing on one foot, put one foot on the drain pipe. I could hold on to the fire escape railing with one hand, and I believe, said Belinda to herself, I believe I could just reach the window ledge. If Madsen has left the window open, I could put a hand inside. Most people, even children, would have thought of the danger of going across that space on a plank that would be narrower, not half as firm as the ilex branch. It would be high above the ground and not protected or screened by other branches or leaves. Most children would have thought of turning giddy or one of the planks wobbling or falling. But Belinda did not give a single thought to any of these things. A plank, she was thinking. A plank. How could I get a plank? And if I did get it, how could I get it up the ilex tree? It was then that her eyes fell on the ladder. There it was, already in the tree, the ladder Tom and the boys had brought up, one end resting on the platform, the other up the tree. It looked as if it might be the right length, not too long to manage, not too short to reach, and it's better than a plank, thought Belinda, wider and more comfortable. The rungs, too, made it easier to tie. I shall have to lash it to the fork, thought Belinda. If I can tilt it forward, tilt it so that it will come down slowly until it is resting flat on the branch. No sooner had Belinda thought these things than she jumped up to try. She managed to ease the ladder forward a little so that she could stand behind it, and I must push its top forward among the branches and see if I can bring it forward and down, thought Belinda. And standing with her feet apart and firmly planted, she gripped the ladder with both hands and pushed. The top came forward, then forward a little more. It caught on a small branch full of leaves, and she had to shake it free. It scraped against a big branch, and she had to jiggle it then. Suddenly it became heavier, too heavy for Belinda. She tried to hold it, but it came down with a rush that almost took her off her feet. Instinctively she let it go, and with a rending of leaves and branches, the ladder fell with a thwack. It was such a thwack that it shook the whole tree. Belinda just missed being hit by the bottom end of the ladder as it sprang up and bounced off the platform. The spirit stove, saucepan, and chair went flying. It was a good thing no one was walking underneath, as Tom said afterwards. For Belinda, the thwack sounded as loud as a clap of thunder. She expected that heads would appear at all the Tiffany Joneses' windows, that on the Fells' side, Mother and Tom, Anne and Nona would run out, calling, "Goodness, what has happened?" Belinda waited on the platform, making herself as flat as possible against the tree, shutting her eyes and holding her breath. But no one appeared. Nobody called, and soon the ilex leaves stopped shaking, and she could dare to look. Luck was with her. The ladder had been caught by the smaller branches and was lying just where she had wanted it to lie, along the big branch. It was a little too sideways on, but with its weight on the branch, it was easy for her to guide it into position, and soon it was lying along the branch, one end resting on the fork. I can push it forward as I come forward myself, thought Belinda. Push it right out until the far end lies on the fire escape. She was delighted. It's wider than a plank, she thought, wider, nice and safe. The ladder was perhaps a foot wide. The drop to the path below was, as you know, all of 14 feet, but Belinda did not think of that. She had her bridge. When she had it in position, Belinda knew she must tie its near end firmly to the fork. She had that much sense. If I didn't, it might slip sideways, she thought. She knew, too, she must be quick or somebody might see her. She cut a length of rope from the boys' store with Anne's girl's guide knife that she was not supposed to touch. Little Plum's coat and socks were ready, pinned to a notice that Belinda had written. She had them in the pocket of her parka. Now she sat down astride the branch beside the ladder, pushing it in front of her, and began to wriggle forward. The ladder, polished and smooth with age, slid along the branch quite easily, more easily than Belinda, who had to keep stopping to slide a leg over a side branch. When she reached the fork, leaning forward, she pushed the ladder on ahead. "Will it be long enough?" she asked. "Oh, will it?" But it was just long enough. When one end rested on the fire escape, the other just lay on the fork. Belinda pulled her rope through the last rung, which was resting on the fork, and quickly lashed it until it was firm. When it was lashed, it did not wobble very much, thought Belinda, but it wobbled a bit, and she breathed hard as she first put one leg, then the other, across the fork, and levered herself forward until she was sitting on the ladder, a leg each side. It did not feel wide or safe. It felt thin and flimsy after the big branch, and Belinda almost went back. But it's only a little way, she told herself. It was certainly not as easy to wriggle forward along the ladder as it had been along the branch. Her trousers kept on catching. She was afraid, too, that the end of the fire escape would tip up, and she wished she could have lashed that end as well. But still, she went forward bit by bit, holding firmly with her hands, slipping them along in front of her. She did not once look down, which was as well, and in a minute her hand went out and caught the railing of the fire escape. Then she was standing on the landing. With a beating heart, she unpinned the notice, and facing the house wall, put her left foot on the drain pipe, and holding firmly to the railing, with her right hand, she stretched out her left, being careful not to catch her sleeve on the rose thorns. The sitting room window was open a crack, and through this, this first time Belinda did not dare to crane forward too far, she was able to stick the notice with the coat and socks through the crack. In 2 minutes more, she had wriggled back along the ladder and was over the fork back in the ilex tree. She could not turn round on the branch to unlash the rope. She had first to go right back along it to the platform, where she turned round and wriggled forward again. Then she had to work herself backwards, pulling the ladder back along the branch until it lay safely hidden among the leaves. Only then was she able to rest, sitting on the platform, but still breathing very hard and waiting for her heart to stop its pounding. She felt as if she had taken an hour, but no, it was only minutes. Nobody had come running. Nobody had seen or heard, and little Plum's coat, her socks, and the notice were safely on Jem's windowsill. From the dollhouse, Miss Happiness and Miss Flower had seen the ilex shaking. They could just see the end of the ladder as it slid out to rest on the fire escape across the way. And, "Is it a bridge?" asked Miss Flower. If it were a bridge, it looked exceedingly narrow, and when they saw Belinda working her way to the end of it, their plaster seemed to creep with fear. Miss Flower especially felt as if she trembled. "Little Miss is as brave as a dragon," she said. When Belinda reached the fire escape, she was lost from their sight in ilex leaves, but they saw her hand reach up to Jem's window. "The new little doll has her coat and socks," they told one another, "and how pleased her little miss will be with what our little misses have done." But of course neither Miss Happiness nor Miss Flower knew what Belinda had printed in big letters on the doll notice. "Can't you keep your doll warm?" Belinda had printed. She had not been able to wait for Jem to come in because it was time for tea, but as soon as tea was over, she slipped out again, ran to her ladder, and climbed up. It was beginning to be dusk, but she could see that her notice was gone. Little Plum was in her usual place on the sill opposite, and she was not wearing the coat or socks. On the window ledge outside was propped a notice larger than Belinda's. Jem had used one of her expensive painting blocks. On it was printed in big letters, "Mind your own business." And underneath was written, and it's warm, W-A-R-M, not warm, W-O-R-M-E. Next day, Belinda found the scarlet jacket and the socks. They'd been wrapped round a pebble and thrown over the hedge into the Fells' garden. End of chapter 5.